Chapter 282, Free of Depraved Thoughts. Chen Ping'an calmly waited for things in Storkin. After leaving the Sword Chi Great Wall where no Tao existed, practicing his fist techniques became much easier in comparison. Before he knew it, he finished throwing the final 8,000 punches. On this day, Chen Ping'an finished performing walking meditation and quietly sat beside the table. He retrieved an adorable little bamboo slip that was emerald green and quite different from the other bamboo slips. There weren't any beautiful lines of poetry inscribed on the bamboo slip. Instead, it was used by Chen Ping'an to record his progress. When he reached 100,000 punches, 200,000 punches, 500,000 punches, and so on, everything was roughly recorded on the bamboo slip. Chen Ping'an extended a finger and lightly ran it over all of the inscriptions on the bamboo slip. Occasionally, he would come across inscriptions that recorded several hundred or 1,000 punches. These often corresponded to the periods when Chen Ping'an was feeling the most upset or frustrated. For example, when he had parted with Mr. Qi outside the old and rundown temple, the period after experiencing the great calamity on Osmanthus Island, and so on. There were many moments that were unknown to other people as well. To put things simply, Chen Ping'an wouldn't count his punches toward his goal of 1 million during these times of unease, no matter how many times he completed walking meditation. Just like that, he reached 1 million punches. Nothing special happened. He was still at the 4th tier, and he was still Chen Ping'an. Chen Ping'an put the bamboo slip away, allowing this old soldier to shed its armor and go into retirement. He then selected a brand new slip made from bamboo from the Azure Divine Mountain. He planned to record his next 1,000,000 punches on this one. Rays of sunshine slipped into his room like a bunch of little children who didn't like to speak. After getting tired, they would lazily lie down on his table, the floor, and even his shoulder. Chen Ping'an quietly sat there and didn't think about anything, or perhaps he was thinking about things that he didn't need to remember. This was also quite good. There was the familiar sound of knocking, waking Chen Ping'an up from his daydream. He didn't ask who it was this time. Chen Ping'an clearly remembered everything about the sword immortal guarding the gate in Stalactite Mountain, from his tone, expressions, sword intent, and so on. In fact, Chen Ping'an even remembered seemingly unimportant details like the strength and pattern of the middle-aged man's knocking. When traveling outside, caution was the key to staying alive. The importance of caution was no lesser than the importance of practicing fist techniques. Chen Ping'an directly stood up and walked over to open the door. Sure enough, it was that middle-aged sword immortal who liked to nod off during the day. He entered the room and placed a thin and flexible golden rope on the table before smiling and saying, "This is a demon-binding chain forged from the golden whiskers of the old flood dragon. It's a genuine immortal treasure. I asked a powerful cultivator from the Taoist sect's talismanic branch to forge this, and he kept 2 segments of the flood dragon whiskers, each as long as a thumb." That was just symbolic payment, though. In reality, the amount of rare treasures that he used to forge this demon-binding chain were definitely worth much more than just that. Just the 3 cloud patterns that he carefully extracted from a Taoist memorial talisman were worth as much as the 2 segments of flood dragon whiskers. I'm not telling you this to ask for praise or credit. I'm simply telling you things as they are. At the end of the day, everything is still thanks to little Ning's face. The other things are nowhere near able to compare with her. Chen Ping'an remained standing the entire time. After hearing this, he cupped his fists and said, "Thank you, Senior Sword Immortal." The middle-aged man who had once again left his sword on the hitching post waved his hand and pointed at the golden demon-binding chain, explaining, "You can control it with your mind once you refine it to the preliminary stage. Even demons at middle 5 tiers will find it extremely difficult to escape once bound. However, it won't be able to restrict demons at the golden core tier or nascent tier for too long. As for demons under the golden core tier, they might not be able to break free from this demon-binding chain at all." Why are demon-binding chains so popular in the world, especially high-grade demon-binding chains? Why are chi refiners who travel around the world so fond of them? This is because they're quite similar to Dragon King baskets in the sense that they can capture the enemy in a single go. They can be regarded as high-grade immortal treasures incredibly good at their job. The middle-aged man suddenly noticed Chen Ping'an's strange expression, so he asked, "What's the matter?" "I don't know how to refine immortal treasures," Chen Ping'an replied in embarrassment. The middle-aged man laughed in anger and exclaimed, "Chen Ping'an, are you joking? Or do you think I'm easy to trick? If you didn't achieve a state of consummate refinement with your sword-nurturing gourd and your 2 flying swords." Sure enough, the middle-aged man was a top-notch sword immortal from the sword Qi Great Wall. His expression turned solemn, and he took another glance at the sword-nurturing gourd tied to Chen Ping'an's waist. He nodded and didn't dwell on this matter any longer. He didn't try to dig for Chen Ping'an's secrets either. Instead, he directly said, "Never mind, I'll teach you a common mantra for refining immortal treasures. Rest assured, you don't need to owe me any favor. This is a mantra that everyone in the sword Qi Great Wall knows. You can treat this as a buy one get one free." The good thing about this mantra is that it's easy to master and use. The bad thing about it is that it will be very easy for Earth immortals to remove the restrictions you place on the demon binding chain if they manage to snatch it away. In the blink of an eye, the demon binding chain will become their immortal treasure instead of yours. The middle-aged man smiled and continued, "With this in mind, if you come across powerful demons in Majestic World in the future, you should run if you can. It's best that you don't take out this treasure and attempt to battle your enemies with it, lest you become a boon for your enemies. All right, I can't stay here for too long. I'll use the voice of my mind to teach you the mantra as well as some things to look out for. If one time isn't enough, then I can repeat it 2 more times." Chen Ping'an nodded, and gentle ripples immediately appeared in his mind's lake. The rich voice of the sword immortal slowly sounded in his mind. Chen Ping'an silently committed everything to memory. "How much of it have you remembered?" the sword immortal asked. "I've remembered everything," Chen Ping'an replied honestly. "However, can I ask Senior Sword Immortal to please repeat it again?" "You're not the overly polite type, are you?" the sword immortal remarked with a chuckle. The middle-aged sword immortal didn't think of this as a hassle. Instead, he appreciated Chen Ping'an's frankness. He repeated the mantra again, and compared to the first time, he even added some comments about his own understanding. These comments were naturally very deep and profound. In his current state, Chen Ping'an definitely couldn't comprehend the wisdom behind these comments. As such, he could only forcefully commit them to memory. The middle-aged man was a straightforward person, so he immediately stood up to leave after teaching Chen Ping'an the mantra. However, before walking out of the room, he looked at Chen Ping'an and said, "The youths in Little Ning's generation truly possess incredible cultivation aptitude. Their aptitude is so good that all of the old geezers smile widely even when they're dreaming. Moreover, it isn't just 5 or 10 of them with such outstanding aptitude. There are almost 30 of them. This being the case, the demon tribe in that world definitely won't sit on their hands and do nothing. They won't wait for death. In addition, the young great demon who defeated me is incredibly renowned, yet he might not even be the most powerful prodigy from the past century. The sword Qi Great Wall is indeed welcoming a generation of rare talents. However, I've also discovered something very strange after observing the many assaults from the demon tribe throughout the past few hundred years. It's as if all of their prodigies have gone into hiding, even those who are only slightly inferior to Little Ning. This is very abnormal. So, I'm a little worried, and I have a nagging feeling that Savage World is planning something big. The 13 battles were only the prelude." Seeing Chen Ping'an's serious expression as he listened, the middle-aged man chuckled in self-ridicule and said, "It's seemingly pointless to tell you about these things. Don't think about it too much." Chen Ping'an insisted on seeing the sword immortal off to the front door of Stork Inn. After arriving in the alley outside the inn, the sword immortal said in an exasperated voice, "I just commented that you weren't overly polite, yet you're now acting as polite as you possibly can. Then I won't be too polite either." After saying this, the sword immortal transformed into a ray of light that shot up from the ground and flew to the foot of Lone Peak. His vast and peerless sword Qi instantly vanished into the distance. Chen Ping'an felt a slight headache. Sure enough, a few guests in the inn exchanged surprised glances with each other. The young innkeeper stood behind the front counter and continued to clack away at his abacus, and it was as if he were completely unfazed by this matter. In reality, however, there was a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It definitely wasn't a bad thing for a guest of his inn to have an extraordinary background. Rare and esteemed guests could shine luster on his inn. When Chen Ping'an walked inside the inn again, the immortals from the mountains who no longer seemed so special in Stalactite Mountain, or else they wouldn't be staying in the small and modest Stork Inn, instinctively cleared a path for Chen Ping'an even though the lobby was more than spacious enough. Chen Ping'an could only pretend that he didn't see anything at all. After arriving in his room, he started to refine the demon-binding chain using the mantra that the middle-aged sword immortal had taught him. This was similar to drawing talismans, and he wouldn't be able to control this high-grade immortal treasure for too long at a time. Everything was dependent on the single breath of true qi of pure martial artists. The longer his true qi lasted, the more power he could wield. Compared to drawing talismans, however, the method of controlling the demon-binding chain was more troublesome for Chen Ping'an, as his bridge of immortality had been shattered. Fortunately, he was able to replenish his qi in a quicker and more hidden manner after advancing to the 4th tier. Indeed, it was much quicker than it had been at the 3rd tier. Thus, he could use the demon-binding chain against demons at the first 3 of the middle 5 tiers, the Abode tier, the Sea Observation tier, and the Dragon Gate tier. He could use it as a trump card. After trapping his opponent, he could unleash his most powerful fist techniques in the shortest amount of time. Of course, the demon-binding chain was effective against all qi refiners, not just demons. It was just more effective against the latter. If he could combine this demon-binding chain with a few talismans that adapted to the terrain and his opponent, and if he could align these with his deadly fist techniques, then Chen Ping'an felt like he would be much more confident. Chen Ping'an spent an entire 6 hours to slowly refine the demon-binding chain bit by bit. When he finally succeeded, he was already completely drenched in sweat. Fortunately, he had the tried and tested cleaning talisman with him. Afterward, Chen Ping'an removed his sword nurturing gourd and placed it on the table. He stared at it and started to zone out. Regarding the 13 battles, Ning Yao hadn't kept anything a secret. She had been willing to carefully explain everything in a calm and nonchalant manner. Chen Ping'an had listened to her speak and hadn't dared to ask anything at all. Not only that, but he had to act as if he were simply listening to a soul-stirring story. In fact, Ning Yao had directly told him, "I was very sad after my mom and dad left me. However, I simply need to slay the enemies and exact revenge for them. I won't overthink this, and you don't need to overthink it either." After saying this, Ning Yao had tilted her head and drank some wine. Her other hand had lightly rested on her heart. In Chen Ping'an's mind, Ning Yao's radiance and intensity at that moment were far greater and much more direct than the first time he had seen her flying on her sword. There was only one other occasion that was comparable. That was back in his hometown when Ning Yao had held 2 fingers together and placed them on her glabella as if opening a third eye. She had claimed that she would expand Jewel's small world. A hint of gold had seeped from her glabella, and she had only been an inch from summoning her bonded flying sword. Thus, Chen Ping'an decided that he would practice the sword. He was going to become a great sword immortal. There would eventually come a day when he would carve a character on the southern wall of the Sword Qi Great Wall. Chen Ping'an took a deep breath and put his sword nurturing gourd away, tying it back to his waist. In fact, Chen Ping'an hadn't drank anything for the past few days. Since he decided to practice the sword, and since he already had the proper sword scripture, as well as the sword that the old sword immortal had lent him, Chen Ping'an started to earnestly mull over this matter. In fact, he was treating this even more seriously than the time he had decided to practice the Mountain Shaking Guide's walking meditation 1,000,000 times. Chen Ping'an stood up and closed his eyes. He then slowly walked around the table. Sword cultivators used swords, and sword practitioners in the cultivation world also used swords. However, the gulf between the two was like the gulf between heaven and earth. When leading his donkey away, Wind Snow Temple's Wei Jin had been a sword immortal at the unpolished jade tier. However, the incredible demeanor of his sword strike was still fresh in Chen Ping'an's memory, even after so long. Meanwhile, regardless of whether it was Sword Saint Song, who was paramount in the cultivation world of Water-Combing Nation, or the Sword God from Colorful Garment Nation, who had died at Ma Kukxuan's hands. It was incredibly difficult for them to rival chi refiners from the mountains, especially sword cultivators. No matter how profound their sword skills were, and no matter how renowned they were in the cultivation world. Chen Ping'an had initially wanted to train in Complete Reed Continent because he had heard that the sword skills of sword practitioners there were much higher than those of Eastern Treasured Vial Continent. Much, much higher. In Complete Reed Continent, even pure martial artists from outside the mountains could potentially challenge chi refiners. If he wanted to become a sword immortal, then he first needed to become a sword cultivator. If he wanted to become a sword cultivator, then he first needed to have a bridge of immortality. He couldn't repair his old bridge of immortality, and his future potential would definitely be limited even if he truly managed to repair it. That being the case, he would construct a new bridge of immortality. However, where would he start? He needed to travel to Parasol Leaf Continent and look for that observing Tao temple in the East Sea. There, he would need to look for an old Taoist priest whose name he still didn't know. However, since the old sword immortal had mentioned the old Taoist priest, this old Taoist priest was definitely a truly incredible immortal. Whether this old Taoist priest was willing to meet him or not was another matter altogether. Chen Ping'an circled around the table again and again. One time, he subconsciously grabbed his sword nurturing gourd and almost took a sip of wine. Fortunately, the intoxicating fragrance of the wine served as a formless warning to Chen Ping'an, causing him to hurriedly put the wine gourd away. When Chen Ping'an arrived in Parasol Leaf Continent, the sword that the old sword immortal had lent him could point him in the rough direction of his destination. Because of this, Chen Ping'an decided to enter Parasol Leaf Continent from the central region. There, he could decide whether he needed to head toward the north or the south. Afterward, he would slowly find his way. While Chen Ping'an was thinking over the details of his trip to Parasol Leaf Continent, a couple arrived at Stork Inn and asked if they could visit Chen Ping'an. They said they were old acquaintances with the young boy. In Stalactite Mountain, those who purposely injured others would be punished by death. This was a very useful rule. Even though there were many profound mystical techniques that could conceal one's actions, the Taoist saber priests in Stalactite Mountain would personally attend to the cases once a breakthrough was made, even if it were tens or hundreds of years after the crime had taken place. In fact, even the Flood Dragon True Lord would personally attend to some cases. Thus, Stalactite Mountain was a rare location of peace and serenity. The young innkeeper led the couple to the hallway where Chen Ping'an's room was located. He pointed them to the young boy's room, but he didn't follow them any further. The woman thanked him, and the young innkeeper smiled and replied that this was nothing but his job. He then left without a worry in his mind. However, he couldn't help but steal a backward glance when he reached the corner. The couple appeared unremarkable and amiable, yet the young innkeeper had a nagging feeling that something was off. In the end, he shook his head and didn't think about this anymore. There was still a long path ahead if he wanted to return Stork Inn to its former glory. Thus, there were always many trivial matters for him to personally attend to every single day. When the couple arrived outside Chen Ping'an's door, the man grumbled, "Why couldn't we appear directly inside the boy's room? Why did we need to go to all this trouble?" The woman shot a glare at him and replied, "How can we abandon all etiquette? Our daughter is already like that, and you're exactly the same. If I'm also like that, then do you really think Chen Ping'an is genuinely a clay bodhisattva that anyone can bully? What? You feel like everything is natural and justified just because our daughter was fortunate enough to find herself a young boy as good as him. Only you find him so pleasant to the eye," the man huffed in reply. "Is he not more fortunate to come across our precious daughter? If he has an ancestral hall, then he should hurry up and offer 100 sticks of incense." The woman was also a stubborn person, so she retracted her hand that was just about to knock on the door when she heard her husband's words. She decided to have a good discussion with her husband, lest he accidentally say something wrong when they entered the young boy's room in a moment. Otherwise, things would become even more difficult to resolve. Majestic World wasn't the Sword Chi Great Wall where death and partings were commonplace. After all, so it was a far more serious matter to hurt others with words in Stalactite Mountain and beyond. This was especially the case with careless remarks. Her husband was a crude person who didn't like to think about these things. As a woman, however, how could she ignore these things altogether? The man hurriedly apologized and said, "All right, all right, all right, I'll listen to you for everything." The woman shot a vicious glare at her husband, and the latter said in a begrudging voice, "I truly know I'm wrong, okay." Only then did the woman lightly knock on the door and ask in a gentle voice, "Chen Ping'an." Inside the room, Chen Ping'an immediately started to pace around in extreme nervousness. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead, and he immediately replied, "Please give me a moment. I'll be over there straight away." The young boy opened the door after a short while. He had changed into brand new clothes, and he was now wearing the golden Tao robe that would appear like a snow-white robe to cultivators under the level of Earth Immortal. He had finally removed his straw sandals as well, changing them for a pair of brand new boots that were also white. Lasting Qi, the sword that had been on his back just then, was already resting on the table. His sword-nurturing gourd, Jianghu, was no longer tied to his waist. It wasn't on the table either, and the young boy had surprisingly hidden it away. The woman and the man exchanged a smile. By the looks of it, the young boy had guessed their true identity. After the couple entered the room, Chen Ping'an gently closed the door and asked, "Do you want some tea?" The woman sat down and shook her head with a smile. She then pointed at a chair and said, "Chen Ping'an, why don't you take a seat as well? When we were in the Sword Reverence Pagoda before, we had no option but to conceal our true appearance. After all, Stalactite Mountain isn't the Sword Qi Great Wall. This place has its own rules, so I hope you can understand." Chen Ping'an sat upright on the seat opposite the couple, with his fists tightly clenched and placed on his knees. He nodded in earnest. The man shot a sideways glance at the extremely reserved young boy, and he became angrier and angrier the more that he looked. This young boy was so timid and rigid, so how could he possibly be worthy of his darling daughter? However, the man's foot was immediately attacked by a vicious stomp from his wife. In the end, he could only look down and hand everything to his wife. After the woman removed her illusion technique, the man also did the same. The couple finally revealed their true appearance. The woman was breathtakingly beautiful, and the man was incredibly handsome. Perhaps this was the true embodiment of an immortal couple. Perhaps this was the reason why their daughter was so stunningly beautiful. The woman seemingly went an extra step to introduce herself, saying, "You should already know that I'm Ning Yao's mother, and he's Ning Yao's father. The two of us were killed in battle to the south of the Sword Qi Great Wall long ago, but our remnant souls were gathered and retained by the old Great Sword Immortal. Even though this stands in contradiction with the customs of the Sword Qi Great Wall, there seems to be no need for dead people to worry about these things anymore. After fighting for so long, it doesn't seem excessive to live for ourselves after being killed. After all, Ning Yao was still little at the time." The woman couldn't bring herself to continue after saying this. Thus, her husband could only take over and continue. When Ning Yao returned from her first trip to the outside world, we immediately knew that there was a problem. The woman coughed quietly. The man could only correct himself and say, "We knew about you. At the time, our daughter was still yet to understand her thoughts and make up her mind. After hearing that you would help deliver the sword to Stalactite Mountain, however, she would always wait for you whether she was busy or not." During those times, Ning Yao had always sat on that dragon-slaying platform by herself. The man had felt incredibly pained whenever he saw this. He hesitated for a moment, and his expression couldn't be considered genial at all. "Will you truly not let Ning Yao down? You should know that Ning Yao is very different from ordinary girls. She's different in every sense." Even though Chen Ping'an was sweating in nervousness and tension, he still had a serious expression as he replied, "I've thought about this before. In the worst-case scenario, Ning Yao will regret her decision in the future and fall in love with someone else. If that person treats her better than I do, then I won't look for her anymore. However, if Ning Yao continues to like me, then I'll also work hard and strive to be different the next time I meet her. It won't be like this time, where I'm nothing more than a burden for her. No matter if she's in the city to the north, on the parapet of the Sword Qi Great Wall, or on the battlefield further south, I'll definitely be by her side. I'll do everything in my ability to protect her. Chen Ping'an's sweat was clouding his vision. He hurriedly wiped his eyes and forehead and continued, "During times of peace when there are no battles, perhaps I'll feel like she's perfect when we're together because I like her so much. However, when we live together in the future, I have to learn to accept her shortcomings as well. I understand this principle. When I was very little, my mom and dad would also argue at times. However, they would never argue in front of me. After having an argument, my dad would sulk in the courtyard by himself. However, my parents would be good with each other again the very next day. Even though I've always felt like my parents are the best people in the world, how can there be people who are truly good in all senses in the world? This definitely can't be the case. However, I'll do my best to understand what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad. And then I'll leave the very best for Ning Yao." There was a dazed expression on the man's face. "Kid, you've already said everything, so what else can I say? Also, just how old are you, Chen Ping'an? How do you understand these principles as well?" The woman used the back of her hand to wipe her eyes. She then smiled warmly and said in a gentle voice, "Chen Ping'an, you endured a lot of pain and hardships during your childhood, am I right?" Chen Ping'an hesitated briefly before eventually nodding in silence. However, after holding back for a long time, Chen Ping'an's face scrunched up and the corners of his mouth turned downward. His voice quivered as he said, "I was almost pained to death when Mother passed away. I was too young back then, so there were far too few things I could do. I did all I could, but in the end, Mother still left me. Going into the mountains to collect medicinal ingredients, pawning off things in the house, cooking rice and making dishes, collecting water from the well, brewing medicine, secretly going to the immortal tomb to pray, placing wild berries in his bamboo basket, fixing his mother's blanket late at night, and asking her if she was feeling better. It didn't help, none of this helped." However, Chen Ping'an didn't say anything else. That was the concluding remark to evaluate himself. He was too young, so he could do far too little. The woman lowered her head and raised a hand to her eyes again. The man heaved a soft sigh. Just how many pains and hardships were there in the world? Was there anything strange about this? Which child who had gone through a rough and challenging childhood lacked these things? Beyond this, however, there was also the consideration of how one endured pains and hardships. Everyone knew about the hardships of life. Everyone knew it was inevitable. But even with that in mind, how did they handle these hardships? The woman exhaled softly and looked up, squeezing out a smile as she said, "Chen Ping'an, we'll leave Ning Yao to you in the future. If she does anything wrong, as a man, you should definitely be more tolerant." "Are the two of you going to leave now? What's Ning Yao going to do after you leave?" Chen Ping'an asked in a quivering voice. The woman stood up and smiled faintly, replying, "Ning Yao knows about this. She knows about everything. So you don't need to worry about this. I'm not praising Ning Yao simply because I'm her mother. Rather, I believe that the girl that Chen Ping'an likes has to be a very good person." Chen Ping'an could only nod. The woman looked at the man who had stood up alongside her. "There's something you want to say?" she asked. The man nodded in reply. "Then I'll wait for you outside," the woman asked in a considerate manner. The man replied. The woman left the room and stood in the corner of the hallway. The man looked at the young boy and called in a solemn voice, "Chen Ping'an." He had been indifferent toward Chen Ping'an the entire time, but now he suddenly started to laugh. He made his way around the table and extended a large palm, solidly patting the young boy's shoulder before retracting his hand and taking a single step back. His hand was still raised, and his palm was facing Chen Ping'an. Chen Ping'an faltered for a moment before hurriedly raising a hand and high-fiving the man. The man firmly grabbed the young boy's hand and asked, "Chen Ping'an, I'll hand my daughter Ning Yao to you in the future. Can you look after her?" "Even if I die," Chen Ping'an replied loudly, choking back sobs. The man released his grip and chuckled, "What do you mean even if you die? The two of you need to live on well." He looked Chen Ping'an up and down and said in satisfaction, "You're worthy of my daughter." He then turned around and strode out. Chen Ping'an wanted to see him off, yet the man had already raised a hand and gestured that the young boy didn't need to follow him. The man didn't turn around as he slowly walked toward the door. The next time you go to the Sword Chi Great Wall, ask Ning Yao to bring you to our graves. You can offer us wine and let us know that you're safe, he chuckled. After striding out of the door, the man suddenly turned around and said with a smile, "What's wrong with drinking wine? Why hide your wine gourd? The most carefree sword immortals in the world all like to drink wine." The man extended a fist and raised a thumb, pointing at himself and saying, "For example, me, your father-in-law." Chen Ping'an remained standing in the same spot for a long time. Today, a treasure-swallowing whale was going to set off from the ferry station, near the incense offering tower and head to Parasol Leaf Continent. Before heading to the ferry station, Chen Ping'an first went to the plaza at the foot of Lone Peak. However, he didn't have a jade tablet that would allow him to enter the Sword Chi Great Wall, so he could only stand outside the railings and glance at that large gate. His lips moved slightly, and it was as if he were talking to himself. The sword-hugging middle-aged man on the hitching post was still dozing off even though it was morning. However, he murmured to himself and said another 3 words. Compared to this first time, however, he simply changed the word approaching to the word leaving. When Chen Ping'an had first approached this gate, he had remarked, "Sword Chi approaching." Now that Chen Ping'an was leaving Stalactite Mountain, he remarked, "Sword Chi leaving." Today, Chen Ping'an was dressed in a snow-white robe with a long sword strapped to his back and a sword-nurturing gourd tied to his waist. He appeared extremely graceful and outstanding. A young boy who was free of depraved thoughts was the most moving thing in the world.